Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Bocci, the Editor-in-Chief and founder of Pain Relief Revolution. Today I want to talk to you about some really interesting new research and studies being done in understanding pain and understanding how things become evolving into chronic pain problems, and also understanding why certain treatments or things may not be as successful as we had hoped for. And hopefully we can use some of this research to start to learn more effective ways of treating pain. This research also sheds a lot of insight and understanding at a deeper level the whole mind-body connection, and understanding why you can't separate what's going on up here or in here with the rest of your body. One of the concepts that you have to start with is this idea of neuroplasticity. And the brain is what we call plastic, meaning it's shapeable, it's moldable. Plastic meaning we can remodel and reshape our brains. Our brain is an ever-changing thing. It's never static. It's always evolving and growing or doing something, or if we're not challenging it enough, it's regressing perhaps. But the brain is a dynamic organism, and because of that, it has a quality to it that we call neuroplasticity. Now, one of the new hot areas of pain research has to do with something called epigenetics. And with epigenetics, this is a study of how gene activity can be modified without actually modifying the sequence of the genes in the DNA. So as you remember, our DNA looks like that helix, if you remember from high school biology. So you have this sort of helical structure, and they form these bonds between these nucleotides, and we have a sequence of different things in our DNA, and that's our unique genetic makeup that we have. With epigenetics, nothing is done to interfere with the sequence of the way the DNA is put together. But what happens is there's a couple ways that it can be modified in a way that the expression of the genes change. And one way of doing that is called DNA methylation. DNA methylation. So this is an important concept that you're going to see a lot more research being done in the field of pain and pain treatment. So methylation means we are adding at certain parts on our DNA methyl groups. And methyl groups are carbon atoms with 3 hydrogen atoms attached to them. That's a methyl group. And methylating the DNA in certain key spots results in changes in the behavior of the DNA, of the type of proteins that we start to create and express for ourselves. And what we see is, in the field of science and disease, that this methylation of the DNA has a huge impact on disease activity and the development of certain diseases. And a hot area of topic of research for that has to do with cancer. And what we're seeing is the body makes its own natural tumor suppressor cells to sort of immunologically protect us from developing out-of-control tumors in our body. But what happens to those cells is we start to lose our ability to manufacture them normally when the DNA or the genes that help produce those get over-methylated. So methylation of cancer-fighting cells is one of the risk factors that leads to certain types of cancers, and we're seeing that in research. We're also seeing when cancer cells start to divide and proliferate in our body, they seem to be undermethylated. So whatever regulation or control the methylation process may have had on the tumor, it starts to unravel and unwind, and then the cells start to grow very aggressively and start to take over our bodies. So you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with pain? But we're going to get there, because interestingly, there's a lot of overlap between this type of disease situation and pain disease situations. One of the things that we're learning about methylation in studying epigenetics is that it's reversible. And this is something we really are just starting to understand a little bit. But this methylation process that changes the way our DNA may be functioning and programming our cells in our body can be reversed or undone. And so once we start to realize that and start to think, well, how can we do that? What are some ways of undoing this? We start to learn some powerful new ways of potentially treating diseases, like in the example of cancer and chemotherapy. So again, what does this have to do with chronic pain? Well, it turns out that epigenetics plays a big role in chronic pain. And in chronic pain states, we see widespread methylation taking place in the brain, in certain key parts of the brain in a very widespread way. And so what we see is change the pain, change the brain. When you start to develop or progress from an injury into a chronic pain state, we start to see these plastic changes of the brain, remodeling, remolding of the brain starts to take place. And part of what triggers that is the way the DNA of the nerve cells gets modified in how it behaves and what it does through this methylation process. So we start to see changing in the methylation process within the brain, and then we start to see changes in the way the brain looks and in the way the brain starts to behave. Interesting study done a couple years ago on degenerative low back pain, degenerative disc disease with low back pain. What they saw was a change in the DNA methylation happening in a key protein used in buffering the disc between our back. And as those proteins deteriorate, presumably that leads to degenerative, or can contribute to degenerative disc disease and increased levels of back pain. And we see methylation of those genes take place, and then a drop in those protective proteins being produced, and the end result being more or progression of degenerative disc problems, ultimately leading to back pain from degenerative disc disease. So there's a real-life example of how this process can lead to a significant pain problem. Now, here's the interesting thing that they're just starting to do more research on and starting to get some clues about. What happens if you take pain medicine? What happens if you take narcotics or opioid pain medications? Certainly, these are the strongest pain medicines we have, and you'd like to think that they would provide an advantage in how our brain processes the pain that we're in. But what we're seeing is being on opioid medications, at least for some period of time, also increases widespread methylation within the DNA of the brain, and creating a situation that is similar in some ways to what the pain does to the brain, and that sort of remodeling that takes place. We see that opioids can have potentially, possibly a similar effect based on some of the latest research that's been published within the last few months. So not only does it change the whole dynamic of or potentially change the dynamics of the DNA in the brain, we see it have effects on certain key parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, which is an area that's heavily studied in pain and heavily affected by people who are in pain. And the prefrontal cortex determines things like the type of decisions that we make, our motivations. Are we going to go to work today? Are we going to get out of bed? Are we going to go to the gym and exercise? And we know that the prefrontal cortex takes a heavy hit when we're in pain, and the decisions that we start to make because of that change. And we see that opioids cause a lot of methylation of DNA in that part of the brain. So very scary thing, something to be concerned about. In addition to that, we see that opioids change the DNA methylation of the opioid receptors in the body. So we start to see modifications of the receptors that we make in our body for the opioids. So we don't know what all that means yet, but certainly when we're studying things like tolerance and dependence and addiction, and even starting to try to understand opioid-induced hyperalgesia, which is a state of where our pain actually gets worse, or we're more sensitive to pain because we've been exposed to opioids for a period of time, starting to understand how does that happen, what causes that, this might provide some clues. But what it also tells us is our environment matters. And what we put in our body, the medicines that we take, the food we eat, the water that we drink, the air we breathe, the things that we think, the breath that we give out is going to have an impact on our DNA and how it functions and the way it gets manifested. And we see that, so we know that the environment matters, and we know that it's going to be critical to expose ourselves to the type of environment that creates this undoing, this reversibleness once chronic pain starts to take over the genetic habits of a person's brain and their DNA in their brain. Interesting, at the research side of it, as I mentioned, we've been understanding this methylation process and how it affects cancer for a while now, and they're looking at special types of chemotherapeutic agents that can go in there and block that methylation or undo that methylation as a way of inhibiting the cancer from growing or spreading, and very powerful concept. Interestingly, they're also going to start to look at that on the pain management side of it and seeing how certain medications or chemotherapeutic type agents might go in and block methylation on DNA, and see how that may also lead to pain treatments down the road. So this is a hot topic, something we're going to start to learn more about and read more about. But for you right now, the good news is it seems to be this process of modifying how our genes behave is reversible. And just as we can remodel a brain into a pain brain, we can also remodel it, because of its plastic qualities, into a pain relief brain, and that gives you a lot of power in what goes on, which is really good news. And there's a lot more research on new things that we can do coming down the road, I think. So this is a really interesting area, epigenetics, that you'll want to follow as we go forward.